Hello, everyone. Welcome to our final webinar in our webinar series. The webinar series is focused around the Handbook of Public Diplomacy, which is a new publication that has just been published this year. It's edited by Professor Shauna Day. And Shauna Day is basically an associate professor at the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. He has a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and he was also the former director of the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication. My name is Babak Bahadur. I'm introducing Sean, and then I will just come on near the end for audience Q&A. And please put your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat. Okay, so with that, I'll pass it on to Sean to introduce our speaker for today.
Great. Thanks, Babak. So this is the final of our four-part webinar series coming out of this book here, the Handbook on Public Diplomacy, which was just released by Elgar. This has been a wonderful series. I want to thank Babak and the Institute for hosting it. Hopefully we can do some more of these maybe in the fall in the next academic year with some of the other authors. But today we're really happy to have Kendra Salois, who is an assistant professor of ethnomusicology at American University down the street from me here at GW. Among other things, she studies the intersections of local musical expression, national belonging, and transnational markets among hip hop practitioners in North Africa and the US, and music diplomacy generally. Her book, Values That Pay, looks at how Moroccan musicians envision an ethical nation while co-producing the authoritarian state. She's going to open by talking about the amazing chapter that she wrote, really thought-provoking, really interesting, one of the best in the book, I think. And as Babak said, as you are listening, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. She and I will have a little chat after she talks about her chapter. We'll talk a little bit, and then we'll open it to the questions from the rest of you. Okay, Kendra, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Babak. Thank you to the Institute for Public Diplomacy for having me. It's really a delight to be here. So as Sean mentioned, I'm an ethnomusicologist. The book he mentioned, Values That Pay, has just been released by UC Press, and that book looks at over 20 years of hip hop production by Moroccans in Morocco, and sort of their intersection with both neoliberal economic restructuring and the authoritarian state. And that's some of where my expertise comes from. So before I jump into what the chapter's about, I'll just talk a little bit about kind of my background in observing, being a participant observer in moments of musical diplomacy. So I started on this research track while I was doing research for my dissertation, so that's a very long time ago now. When I watched the U.S. State Department and the embassy and consulate in Morocco at first, and then in other places as well, bring popular musicians to the country, and I was in a position to sometimes meet the Americans and often the Moroccan artists who were being put together, and to watch how those interactions went. So I was lucky enough to be able to observe that from the musicians' point of view, or at least have a better insight into how the musicians felt about their interactions, and to analyze those from a musical perspective. So that gave me a relatively unique angle in the sort of spread of diplomats, practitioners, scholars, and historians who write about musical diplomacy. So I've really started to focus in on moments of miscommunication or failure from the musician's point of view, to ask what makes for a successful musical collaboration in these instances. I think many people who have witnessed musical diplomacy, sponsored by the US or not, can offer anecdotes of really moving moments of collaboration, moments when the communication seems almost magical and seamless. And I've also seen moments where it falls apart or where it looks good to an uninitiated observer, or an audience member, but is not satisfying to the performers. So a lot of what I do is question what are the assumptions that propel these kinds of interactions, these kinds of short-term um, collaborations, and how does that benefit or not benefit the musicians themselves, and what ripple effects does that have? So the chapter that I wrote for the handbook, which Sean graciously invited me to do, and I was so happy to contribute, kind of stems from that set of observations or set of like kind of research questions to offer some insights on what I think ethnomusicologists and music scholars more broadly can offer to the wider study of musical diplomacy. And then if you scale it from that, cultural diplomacy or public diplomacy. So I'm kind of thinking of music diplomacy as one part of the like nested chart, right? So under cultural diplomacy, there's arts diplomacy, and under that, popular music diplomacy, sort of somewhere over here, right? So in that space where I happen to have some expertise, coming from there, I'm suggesting things that I think music scholarship is really well prepared to offer to the broader study of public diplomacy. So I'll just talk briefly about kind of those three interventions that the chapter lays out, and we'll go from there. So the first one is a subheading in the chapter called Toward a Translocal and Transnational Perspective. I'm sure most people on the call realize that the majority of research, especially in English, on public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy more specifically, is either about the US's efforts historically or today, or um, written in conversation with relation scholarship about that, research about that, because it's kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the scholarship, if not, and probably also in public diplomacy practice. So one thing that ethnomusicologists are particularly well prepared to do, um, as I was lucky to be able to do, is write from the perspective of the locale that's being targeted, or on the other hand, right from the interior perspective of the agencies or musicians or other practitioners from a non-US point of view. So, in my view, the more studies we have of groups, and I say that broadly, whether that's at the nation state level or sort of a non-profit level, that are taking on the practices and techniques of public diplomacy, the more studies we have of those from broader geographical regions, the better off we are. So in this bit of the chapter, I note that there's kind of an overwhelming assumption, an overwhelming debate, I'd say right now, about whether when we look at cultural diplomacy, we need to pay equal attention to non-state actors. And to me, rather than a question of sort of like the policy of the research or whether we're taking an IR perspective on state and non-state actors, I think of this as a question of scale. Because whether you're looking at, for example, the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs in the State Department, or you're looking at a nonprofit that benefits from state funding to carry out public diplomacy objectives, you're still looking at a collection of people. So, um, because I'm an ethnomusicologist and an ethnographer, I tend to start from who are the decision makers, what is the network, how are these relationships? So really drilling down to that, regardless of what kind of agency you're focusing on, um, can I think offer a different perspective. It's not to say that researchers aren't already doing that, but there are some perspectives in diplomacy research that are necessary, but that tend to speak from an agency perspective. So I think a balance of that can really benefit as a whole. The next thing that I really in thought of as an intervention that music scholars might be good at promoting, and this is really particularly for music and arts scholarship, music and arts diplomacy scholarship, is focusing in on and really developing a transdisciplinary but mutually useful definition of what we mean when we research and talk about exchange. So, exchange is one of those terms that can be used in a variety of ways. And um, I think I'm riffing on Wittgenstein here, but the like the fuzziness of the term is sometimes to its benefit or to different people's advantage. So sometimes, especially when I'm speaking with students about my research and I talk about musical exchange programs. I'm literally talking about programs that are set up so that one group of people goes to another place, and then sometime later, a group of people from that place come back to the US. But my students use exchange in a much more loose way. Just the idea of like being in a room and sharing something is a form of exchange. Neither of those are the third, maybe most literal definition of exchange, where you give something to someone and you get something else in return, and then you both go away with objects, right? The kind of transactional idea of exchange. But all the potential concepts are kind of crowded around one another, or maybe in a nucleus around that idea of transaction. So thinking really about what it means to hold an exchange, what's actually being exchanged. Is it an idea? Is it a technique? Is it a sound? Is it people? Like, what exactly do we think we're exchanging when we meet? Is it an exchange or is it more like a collaboration? Um, if it's an exchange, what are the products that are being taken away from the interaction? Um, it sounds like it's a lot of semantics, but I think delving into what different practitioners in any music diplomacy event understand by exchange can give us insight into, again, what they think they're actually doing there. So one of the things that music scholars, especially economic ethnomusicologists, have been trying to think about is, again, why we apply the term exchange to interactions where it's musical ability, musical knowledge, and musical practices that are being collaborated upon or mutually explored, right? So, someone that I've been really influenced by is an ethnomusicologist named Anna Morecambe. As well, people like Jonathan Glasser or Annette Weiner, who is an economic anthropologist. All of them have been thinking about the ways that when you train someone in or teach someone in your musical tradition, it's not leaving you. Like you're not exchanging it for something of theirs and then those go away from the original person. You're sharing it and it doesn't leave you. So exchange is not the right word there, especially because it posits that the exchanger and the exchangee, right, are actually, they're both exchanger and exchangee at the same time, and they're on an equal playing field. But when you think about someone coming to share and then receiving something in return, but not being separated from or alienated from their original thing they were sharing, that doesn't have to say anything about the social or economic equality of those parties, right? So, in fact, sharing what you have and having it not really leave you, but having the ability and the access and the resources to share it could put you in at another level so that inequality is actually maintained or even enhanced. And that's a factor in the ways that the US in particular sends musical performances abroad that has been brought up to me again and again in the research that I do. So musicians from the US will often tell me anecdotes about meeting the people that they're meant to work with when they arrive at their destination and having them say, well, we already know what we're doing. We already do what we do. We don't need you to teach us. Just because you come from the US doesn't mean you're the authority, right? We have our own tradition over here. Um, so often they confront the assumption that because of the role US plays in global popular culture and in global geopolitics, the musicians that are arriving also think that they're going to lead these otherwise, or these not otherwise, just very, very well developed, very proficient musicians, and they have to disabuse them of that. So there's a lot we can do on our side, the research side, I think, in thinking about what it means to all parties when we use the word exchange. And the last bit, and I know I'm going on here, so the last bit
No,
I'll
it's great. It's great.
a bit more. The last intervention in this chapter is the idea of bringing in different kinds of data, data at different scales, and data from different perspectives, and kind of expanding what we consider data that we use in our research in an interdisciplinary way. Um, So this is a bit a call for us to sort of read across the disciplines that are doing diplomatic research, and take into account that different disciplines are going to operate at different scales. And it's in service of the idea that we can have a critical approach within the interdisciplinary diplomacy studies, that does not take away from the insights of scholar practitioners and does not take away from those whose goal is to offer recommendations for better diplomatic policy or practice, and still have research that speaks to those whose concerns lay outside of diplomacy proper and are interested in asking broader questions about like power in international relations. Um, or even just, from my perspective, even just the global circulation of popular musics, right? So a critical approach doesn't need to mean simply research that seeks a way to critique and stops there, as I'm sure everyone on this call realizes, but more just an approach that's takes a disinterested perspective and looks at all the different data that we can bring to it, in a neutral fashion. So one of the things I highlight in that section is that, at least out of my experience, I know of very little data collected on US diplomacy initiatives and their impacts beyond the things that people on the ground at a given diplomacy event collect. So, as you know, the consulate or embassy officers might send cables, might have memos. Those are often the reports, or local press hopefully covers the event. Those are often the things that make it into archives so that musicologists or
Yeah.
those concerned with a historical approach, that's usually what they have to work from. Those who are lucky enough to be working on an exchange or a collaboration or an event where there's a good local archive might also be able to see more local reaction, at the time or a bit afterwards if they can find that archival material. For contemporary things like the stuff that I focus on the most, such as the US's Next Level program, which briefly takes like 3 to 5 hip hop artists in different media and sends them to a place for around 2 weeks to do workshops, um, and does 4 or 5 of those each year. For something like that, what the archive is and will be in the future is really totally up in the air because this program's only been around since 2014. Um, and at the same time, the stuff that I am most interested in as a musical ethnographer, the impacts that skill sharing and conversations and co-performance and collaboration have on the musicians and the students at the place the US artist went to, those are the least likely to be archived because no one is doing the work of, say, interviewing them or maybe even recording the performance outside of one or two, US embassy officers who remembered to turn on the camera. So, the local press that covers the event, right, is going to interview the US performer rather than the 15-year-old Bangladeshi hip hop artist because why would they, right? So we're still dealing with a preponderance of US voices in that archive. So, this last section is really just calling for, everyone to take seriously the idea of trying to gather as much data from maybe the least powerful and least heard voices in the event going forward. So those are kind of the three major sections of the paper, and I, yeah, really look forward to a conversation. I'd love to hear
Yeah.
from those in the webinar.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you so much. There's so much to chew on. One of the things I really appreciated about your chapter and you in your talk here today is this different perspective. And one of the things that really runs through what you wrote is how different scholars from different backgrounds and different traditions ask different kinds of questions, and that informs what we know about a topic as big as diplomacy. I said that you and I were going to have a conversation at first, but um, a lot of what you talk about is what's happening at the embassy level or on the ground. And we do, at least for a few minutes here, have someone with us who is with the Institute, our public diplomacy fellow, who is a career public diplomacy officer and State Department officer, Joe Weirix. Joe, I know I didn't prepare you for this, but I was wondering, given what Kendra's been talking about, if you could talk about it from the perspective of someone who's been in embassies and brought musicians, including hip hop artists. I mean, she talks about a lot more than just hip hop, but um, what that experience is like from you. What are you trying to do when you're a public diplomacy officer and you're abroad in an embassy and you're bringing musicians over? What's your goal? And she specifically talks about this idea of metrics and audience participation, and the collaboration and all that sort of thing. What can you talk about it from the perspective of someone who's been in an embassy?
Right. Well, it's no accident, I think, that uh, the two major music forms that have dominated U.S. musical diplomacy uh, were first jazz and then
Mhm.
hip hop, which have at their core the idea of improvisation, right? And I think that that's in many cases, that's the subtext that we're using to amplify another thematic element, right? The ability um, to use first jazz, now hip hop as a means to empower voices that perhaps didn't feel that sort of agency or ability to participate in broader society. And so, as with so much of what we do in public diplomacy, it's meant to have this capacity to um, sort of bring new agency to elements of society that we're on the outside looking in. Whether that's empowering, in my case, in a tour in Israel, sort of members of the Bedouin community to see new ways to raise their voice, or to bring Jewish youth and Arab Israeli youth together for to work on, the idea of writing their own kind of cipher, writing their own way to kind of speak their voice together in a way that would like got them sharing feelings about community. I had like just a terrific example of uh, a a program that brought a hip hop artist to Israel, where she did that kind of community engagement, and then while walking on the streets of Haifa, was able to engage in an impromptu jam session with a klezmer band on the street. A crowd gathered, and it became this kind of impromptu moment. It was covered in the local Haifa media. um, the kind of multiplier effect from this kind of program that just comes from its improvisational nature, just the talent that you're bringing on these programs. Their creativity is the sort that doesn't need sheet music. It doesn't need a quiet room. It's happy to engage in the rough and tumble of getting out with the public, and that's part of why, so long as you, as the office running these programs, approach it with a bit of flexibility in how you think about making best use of the time and talent of these participants, you get some incredible outputs.
Can I jump in here because
Yeah, of
I'm
course.
so fascinated by the way you framed this and how you focused in on improvisation. Um, Also, heads up, Joe, I'm absolutely going to ask to interview you for real later. Um, so the theme that you're drawing here, the idea that at the core of both jazz and hip hop, which I think we rightly always return to when we're telling the story of the successes of U.S. musical diplomacy, not that, sending classical music and classical dance, college choirs, other stuff like that abroad isn't worthy. It absolutely is, but jazz and hip hop have gotten the most press both here and abroad. They had and have certain things in common, right? Definitely that improvisatory core that you mentioned. Also the fact that at the time that they were being focused on, both in the 50s and 60s, for the most part, in the CPP, and today, um, they were considered the genre that had the most global appeal, the most global circulation, and was the most likely to appeal to the youth that then and now. Um, Public diplomacy professionals wanted to know we're seeing and hearing these American exports, for different reasons in each case. And that improvisation, that creativity, and that desire to get out and meet with people who have their own improvisatory traditions in both cases is really at the heart of not just American musical expression, but African American musical expression. Like these are two genres that come from a broader stream of African American and Afro-diasporic expressive culture, particularly Black Atlantic expressive culture, and really without an acknowledgement of that, some of that improvisatory skill, magic, and potential meaning loses its force. And this is where US diplomacy has been so strategic and successful, right? I often tell my students if the US's brand is freedom of expression, then musical diplomacy is a win-win because when musicians go abroad and say something that contradicts what the musicians expect to hear from an American citizen, the broader project gets viewed as something where musicians are free to express their disagreements, and that is a win-win. If they don't, that's still a win because then the controversy never occurs in the first place, and people get to enjoy good music and great moments of collaboration. And my students love to chew on that and think about the implications of it. But again, that wouldn't have been so successful for jazz in the mid 20th century and hip hop today if not for the belief in the US and elsewhere that the public sphere that jazz and hip hop are in theory demonstrating or depicting um, is powered by African American expressive norms and African American traditions. And I chased Joe away with
No,
my
no, he he does have to run to his regular job that has a big call. 20 minutes before this started, the reorganization plan came out of the White House. But I think the point is well taken, and you talk a bit about this in the chapter, and specifically you do mention what's commonly sometimes called the Jazz Messengers Program. You said CPP, et cetera. There's different names for it. But when the U.S. was sending these amazing jazz musicians like Brubeck and Louis Armstrong and others abroad, and as you said, and as you wrote in the chapter, a lot of the historical conversation around that has to do with the way in which, as Joe was saying, the way in which jazz, the Black experience, improvisation, etc., were ways in which the U.S. could or thought that it was able to sort of reinforce its themes of freedom. Here, we're sending people out in the middle of the civil rights movement when many of these musicians don't have equal rights at home, and they're free to talk about that, which they did. But what I thought was interesting in your chapter was that, in part, I think because of your academic background, is you're looking at things not only from that perspective, but also from the perspective of the audience, the individual musician. Use this word polysemy, which I think most people on the call probably know, but the idea that people, everybody can interpret things differently, that a lot of meaning is in reception, and that kind of redirects what we're looking at towards, from the state-centric view of diplomacy to whether that's the individual musician or the individual audience. I'm wondering if you can expand on that a bit about how that kind of perspective might inform diplomacy itself, even from the practitioner level, someone like Joe.
Absolutely. So I immediately thought of two anecdotes that might illustrate what you're pointing to. So, and both of these are from Mark Katz, who was the founding director of the Next Level program, which I briefly mentioned. Again, it's a U.S. Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs program that sends teams of hip hop artists in different media abroad to do workshops and collaborations with both amateurs, like anyone who wants to come learn, and local professionals or local highly polished people. Um, for probably 2 or 3 weeks, and they send 4 or 5 of these a year, and they've done that since 2014. Mark Katz is a musicologist at UNC Chapel Hill, and he was the founding director of the program. Today, and this is relevant, today, the executive director of the program is a former Next Level participant. He's a dancer and dance teacher. His name's Junius Brickhouse. Next Level has gone from being more or less run by Meridian, a nonprofit third party that often helps execute U.S. public diplomacy programming, to not self-run, like they definitely work in partnership with Meridian and the ECA, but having their own staff that are made up entirely of working artists and artist teachers who have been through the program. So the people who manage sites and kind of act as the team manager when the teams go abroad, the people who scout out with the executive director once the State Department has decided where the teams are going each year, the people who run all the logistics, the people who train those who are coming up, the people who do their own metrics to the extent that they do. They're all people who have been through the program as musicians and teachers. Um, so that is a that's a great illustration of something I think you're getting at. Like maybe focusing on the experiences of the practitioners and operationalizing them is a path forward for sustainable public diplomacy that gets around some of the sort of common reactions. Um, Again, like the things I mentioned, where people are like, "Who are you to come here and tell me what to do?" Right? Like that reaction might not happen if the people they see 3 months before the event, plan out the event, are themselves practitioners who can say exactly why they've done the program, why they continue to work with the program, and why it's beneficial. So that's one great example.
So interesting because I always think of music as inherently collaborative. It's inspired by other traditions and all the examples we have throughout the history of music, which I'm certainly not an expert on, but you are, of, how cultures, the music in one culture influences another culture through trade or through just people visiting or through concerts. Or concert tours, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so this thing you bring up about how, sometimes when you talked at the beginning about your origin story about thinking about when public diplomacy goes wrong and when it doesn't work, and these examples of, okay, we bring in an artist, the U.S. brings in an artist, and they're basically talking at their audience instead of working with their audience. That seems so counter to what public diplomacy is supposed to be. There's another aspect of that though, to the broader, you talk about the sort of levels of analysis that, one of the things we know about exchange programs, or we think we know about exchange programs, is that they work best when the people on both sides of the exchange, traditional exchange programs, they work best when both sides of the exchange, the people participating, feel like they are peers with each other. If you think about like military exchanges, when you've got higher level officers with lower level officers, they don't work as well. And I was thinking about that when you were talking about that example of when it goes wrong. Is it that sometimes these programs are built around a kind of hubris, or is it that they don't have enough local buy-in or local consultation? I'm trying to think of what the sort of variable, coming from my perspective, I'm thinking, well, what are the variables where we can predict
Mhm,
what's successful, et cetera?
mhm. Yeah, so I wouldn't start from hubris, especially from the practitioner's point of view. Every US musician and non-US musician I've been able to interview has emphasized how lucky they were to have these opportunities. Even when they talk about their ambivalence in engaging with it or being paid by the US government, which nearly all of them do. And I should say, right, like my expertise is grounded in part in the fact that US musicians who have gone on trips that I've interviewed have often very sophisticated and well-defined critiques. Um, and then a lot of my research has been thinking about, well, what is it that leads them to choose to participate despite this critique? Like, it's not to say that the critique is insincere or that they don't have ambivalence, but what is it that leads them to go ahead with it, right? And so often, US musicians, in particular, talk about how this is an amazing opportunity they could never have created for themselves. Side note, though, part of my current research is looking at the ways that nonprofits that are not sponsored by or connected with states are learning from and using diplomacy practices. Like, for example, there's a wonderful nonprofit organization in DC known as Words, Beats, and Life. In DC, they offer free hip hop arts training to children from ages like 8 to 20, and they're enormously successful at that. But they also have what they call the Hip Hop Embassy, where they and some of the musicians they work with really frequently travel to different places. They recently sent the MC Substantial, who's DC born and raised, to Nepal for a collaboration. And they did this like I think they had funding in part from the city, and from other, they're very good at articulating public and private funding. But this was not a State Department event whatsoever. They just borrowed from the techniques that they've seen both as participants and as observers. So that's really fascinating to me. But to go back, hubris is never something that comes up with practitioners, except again in the anecdotes where people fear they will encounter hubris and then
Mm.
learn that is not the case. Um, but what I have seen is that practitioners are often not given the time and space and access they need to really collaborate. So what they end up having is like party A and party B are on the stage together, and what they were able to rehearse was like the transition between that. And to an
Mm.
audience, it's still great. It's great music, and they saw these people on the stage, and they heard like Party A musician come in on the chorus of Party B's song, even though they're kind of doing it phonetically because they don't understand the language. And it worked for the audience. And so, from the State Department's or the embassy's point of view, it's a huge success. It gets local coverage. It does what they needed to do. From the musician's point of view, it was not a real collaboration because they were expected to do things like um, improvise a song together when they literally don't speak each other's languages and they have 3 hours. So,
Right.
like, if music is a universal language, um, that doesn't mean that it also means every other language becomes intelligible, right? There's now, for all of the wonderful collaborative and improvisatory moments that I've witnessed and that others have witnessed and that are so meaningful, there are still many where musicians just aren't given the time and space to do work. And so for some of them, they come away perceiving that the people who are organizing the programming don't actually understand that what they do is work and takes time and effort.
One of the things I hear you saying, and then I'll go to Babak for some questions from the audience, but is that one of the notoriously difficult things about public diplomacy is measuring its success, metrics, et cetera. You quote someone in your chapter saying that metrics can't measure how valuable these programs can be.
Mhm.
And if I'm hearing you correctly today, you're saying that one of the things that you're saying is that we collect traditional data on we pass out things, did the audience enjoy it, you mentioned local press coverage, things like that, but maybe among the things that we might be adding are more qualitative data, interviews with the actual musicians themselves and others. Is there anything, am I getting that right, and is there anything else that we can think about in terms of measurement and metrics, particularly in an era when those are under extra scrutiny around the world, but especially in the United States?
What I'd add here is that I don't know to what degree US musicians are debriefed and their impressions are sought out and in what form in the different programs that the US runs. So it might look different from one place to another. So I don't want to, assume that all of them are not doing that enough or something like that. Um, I can point to moments in US musical diplomatic history where musicians put forward critiques or suggestions that aren't taken up. In the chapter, I noted that Randy Weston, for example, a jazz musician, wonderful pianist who went on several programs during the Jazz Ambassadors period, and who was inspired by that to spend years in Morocco researching different Moroccan musics, had kind of an essay's worth of suggestions after
Mm.
some of his tours. And we know that because it's archived, but we don't know to what extent they were like heard. Um, so there are examples like that. The other thing I would say is that so far, um, more than one person has noted, some in publications, again, such as Marquette's, and some in private conversation, that there is a strategic value to limiting the kinds of feedback that are available.
Oh,
so that if you fear your program, which you think is meaningful and valuable and has a multiplier effect that is not wholly quantifiable, um, might be in danger, then having less information might be better than having more information, depending on
interesting.
your audience.
Also a evergreen problem in this field. Babak, do we have a question?
Yes, we have four questions so far, so I'll start with the first one in the order they came in. First one is by Carl Stoltz. As someone who ran the ECA Cultural Programs Office for 2 years and ran many programs in the field, I'm really enjoying this dialogue. And in another time when political debates in DC raged about whether cultural diplomacy matters or should be cut, I recall a PAO who wrote, we have had dozens of VIPs from the US visit this country in the past few years, and no one, even those who were in the meetings, can remember the dates of what was achieved. Yet everyone here can remember the US band that performed here 5 years ago and what they played. Cultural exchange connects across cultures emotionally. This is why it works. Would Kendra agree or disagree with this characterization?
Thanks,
Yeah,
Carl.
Carl, thank you. Also, I would love to hear more about your experience. Yeah, I think that's right on. Cultural diplomacy, whether it's in music or in other art forms, does evoke strong emotions and often physiological responses. There's an intersubjective um, dimension to this that, having a panel or having a dinner or listening to a speaker doesn't evoke, right? The literal sensation that you're sharing something with someone is part of what your body does, what it respond, how it responds to stimuli like watching a dancer or listening to an improvisation. And that's a huge part of it, right? And it's real. It's not something to say is like sort of fanciful or discounted. It works because it works for us in all settings. Whenever we experience moving music and arts, we're responding in part physically as well as mentally and emotionally, right? There's also always just the wonder of watching musicians who are at the top of their game, just watching musicians who excel in their craft. Just the same way that sports diplomacy works, I imagine, right? Watching someone who just is a beautiful football player, soccer player, um, can evoke awe and wonder and delight, right? Like Dizzy Gillespie would no doubt have evoked the same thing. Some of today's practicing hip hop artists freestyling about the things they've witnessed over the last 3 days in this new place evokes the same thing. So, yeah, that's absolutely at the core of why exchanges, or rather, I guess, interactions, can be so memorable. And um, again, like I try to, my research is coming from a critical perspective, which I'll reiterate is not about critiquing always, but about providing a scaled up, broader perspective that takes into account those of practicing musicians and practitioners that are like less often heard in diplomatic research. So absolutely none of the people that I've worked with would say that that emotional connection isn't there or isn't important. They take for granted that that's why it works. There's also other things to say about it, though.
I
Great,
was
thank
lucky
you.
enough to see Dizzy Gillespie. He was definitely awe-inspiring. What's our next question?
Sure. This is from an anonymous attendee. I was curious as to the role of considering economics in cases of cultural exchange. Is there an idea of empowering other nations to produce their own music as both a form of income through selling music, as well as developing a domestic or international marketable national identity? Or is that more a byproduct and not even an idea at all?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
So what I've seen again in my research, which is, over the last 10 to 15 years, is that when practitioners go to a place, they're they tend to go instructed to share music and expertise and connect on an emotional and cultural and interpersonal level, and also to do some other theme. So for next level, the next level program, it's often conflict resolution. For other places, it's entrepreneurship. Um, so they often come with the suggestion that they highlight that seemingly extra musical theme. So empowerment is a huge one, but it's so vague that that can look different in every place and in every event. Um, and none of the people that I've talked to, none of the things that I've witnessed were about um, creating something that was destined for the commercial market. Um, and none of the conversations that I've had, um, in none of those conversations did people bring up trying to find an internationally marketable artistic identity. I've definitely witnessed and heard about secondhand conversations where people in targeted or host places were concerned about raising the visibility and legitimacy of their own practice in their national public sphere. Um, but not so much like, and we have to, for example, develop a cohesive, internationally visible and recognizable form of Greek hip hop, right? Not That's not really the idea that comes up. Certainly, lots of people involved in the exchanges, um, both in the US and elsewhere, are concerned about increasing their commercial visibility and audibility, their commercial circulation. Um, but the workshops and events that are planned in the next level program and in other programs that I've seen don't really lend themselves to that. There are absolutely kind of one-offs where there's more of a focus on cultural entrepreneurship. For example, um, a couple years ago during COVID, one of the things that one of the events that happened was like I forget which American university it was that has a campus in Abu Dhabi. I think it was Berkeley, Berkele, well, Berkeley, the College of
The
Music.
music school. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yes, that one.
Two E's. Yeah.
Berklee. Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
Berkeley has an Abu Dhabi campus, and there was like a cultural entrepreneurship in the arts kind of program that some of the US um, exchange artists participated in. So something like that is more of a one-off than common, at least in my experience.
Great, thank you. The next question is by Ty Lackey. Considering the current climate, some programs like One Beat and Next Level may see pauses as you discuss the role of the archive in making the practice of exchange, particularly with improv, accessible. Can you also discuss the role of intellectual property rights and how the landscape may be changing in the context of hip hop as both a diplomatic tool and expressive resistance?
Okay, this is a great question, Ty, and thank you for bringing it up. Again, I'd love to hear more about your background since you mentioned One Beat, and I don't think we brought it up. So, super briefly, One Beat is a US exchange program that is more of a traditional exchange where um, I think it still looks like this. It's splintered somewhat in the post-COVID era. But in the beginning, One Beat was a program where they would select a range of countries, like a large number of countries, maybe even 20, and audition and select a musician from each of those places, bring them to the US to be in an extended collaborative workshop with US musicians, probably four, five, or six of them. And all of the musicians, regardless of what they played and what traditions they were expert in, were skilled improvisers. So the goal for One Beat originally was put all of these people in a beautiful retreat space and let them cook, really, like let them collaborate with different people and different small ensembles of people. And then once these things have kind of coalesced, take that resulting program on the road in the US. So it's unlike any of the other exchange programs in that way and is a really great idea. And anecdotally, I've heard that people who've been part of the One Beat program form really effective and long-lasting connections. So I'll just put that there for those who weren't aware of it. I'm definitely not an intellectual property expert in any way. So you write Can you also discuss the role of intellectual property rights and how the landscape may be changing in the context of hip hop as both a diplomatic tool and expressive resistance? Um, for hip hop broadly defined, um, at least in the US, where intellectual property rights have and the application of copyright um, have already moved hip hop very far away from its original practice. That kind of that limit on how musicians can use samples um, and audible references to previously recorded commercial music. Um, that has already happened. That happened as early as the 1990s, and was much more acute in the 2000s. So that, if any, as any hip hop fan knows, right? If you listen to productions like those of, say, Public Enemy, which is built out of tiny snippets of maybe dozens of songs, in the late 1980s, and then you listen to sample-based music in the 2010s and today, licensing is so much more onerous and um, so much more effectively surveilled that musicians, all but the most commercially successful musicians, really can't afford to sample more than one or two things. So it just changes the production strategies and changes the aesthetics. How does that change the ability to resist or to express resistance? Within hip hop aesthetics, I'd argue that being unable to put samples in conversation with one another or being less able to create something where samples are in dialogue or in juxtaposition rather than like a core around which you build your own voice, just means you're articulating less of a dialogue. You're articulating less of a callback to history. You're articulating fewer points of memory and historicization and contextualization for the listeners to build their own conclusions around. And then how that works in the context of the diplomatic event. Um, I honestly don't know, and it's a great question. I can only think of a couple examples in which practitioners who were collaborating were encouraged to record something for commercial release. Um, and I can't think of any in which it was released in the US and subject to US copyright law, but that's a really good question.
Yeah, we'll never hear another Paul's Boutique. Um, Kendra, we have a couple of minutes here, and obviously, as a couple of the questions have intimated, we are in, to quote the borrow from the proverb, in interesting times here. So I wonder if you could briefly, as we close out here, um, what's the case for music diplomacy? Why should this be funded? Why is this something that any country, but let's just take one that's going through some things, the United States, um, prioritize? Why is this important?
What a great question. Um, I'll give you my honest take on that. Again, as an ethnomusicologist rather than a diplomacy practitioner,
Mhm.
and someone who focuses on the experiences of the musicians rather than the potential to generate goodwill. Um, I still think it's valuable because of what it offers to the musicians. Um,
Mhm.
the musicians that I've spoken with, again, mostly US, but also abroad, um, they don't just come away with more of an insight into Americans who share one of their passions. No doubt that's a goal of public diplomacy, and it's often very effective, that particular goal. They don't just come away with that, right? They come away really renewed and inspired often, even if that collaboration like didn't work quite how they wished it would, or they wish they had more time, or they wish they had better equipment, or whatever. Um, they often come away really renewed and inspired because someone from thousands of miles away gets it. Someone beyond their often really small community. And I'll note, right, that today the US musicians sent abroad, whether they're in jazz or rock or hip hop or bluegrass or Zydeco or whatever, they are not the world's most visible musicians. Like we are not sending um
Dave
Beyonce.
Brubeck.
Right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, we're not sending
Beyonce,
Dave
right.
Brubeck. The U.S. State Department has long since decided it can't afford that and is not going to. But that's actually good in the context of their goals today. And again, from my perspective, in the context of the musicians' um, benefits, because it makes for the possibility of exchanges that are so meaningful for both the U.S. musicians and the musicians abroad. Sending people who are highly expert in their field as musicians, like highly expert musicians, but also people who have been trying to make at least part of their living as performing musicians in a place where that's extremely hard, because we don't subsidize music the way that other developed nations do. And then sending them abroad to talk to people who, again, might be in a state that has a different perspective on how to subsidize their art forms and yet aren't getting a piece of that, or maybe just are in a place where the resources are so thin that regardless of what the state thinks it wants to do, it can't support them. Or they actually face a lot of the same struggles as practicing musicians. Um, and many of the US musicians, again, coming from or in traditions that have Afro-diasporic roots, even if they themselves are not of African descent, are acutely aware of what it means to continue to spread that in a respectful and truly collaborative, truly reciprocal way. So for the musicians themselves, I think just, it's enormously beneficial. And for that alone, I hope it continues.
Well put. And I would say that that scales up from there too to audiences and everybody else. Thank you so much. As I
Thank
said, this
you.
was the last of our webinar series for now, at least. Before we leave, I do want to say something briefly. This book is dedicated to Walter Roberts. Most of people on this call know who Walter Roberts was, but if you don't, Walter Roberts was one of the original Voice of America broadcasters who joined the U.S. government in 1942. He spent 8 years at VOA before transferring to the State Department, having a long career as an amazing diplomat, including working under George Kennan in the Balkans and senior career post at U.S. Information Agency. Among many, many other things, he taught the first college course in America on public diplomacy right here at the Elliott School for International Affairs at George Washington University. And then near and dear to our heart, Babak and mine's, he founded what was then called the Public Diplomacy Institute, which is now the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, which Babak runs now. I directed for a number of years. And he endowed that institute and was on its board almost up until the end of his very long life. He was a great diplomat, a great benefactor, and a truly great friend to many of us. And so this entire thing couldn't have happened without him. So I wanted to say that. Thanks again to Joe Reericks and the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication for hosting this, to Babak, its director, who has been wonderfully supportive of this entire project, and to the team there, including Rocio and Devani, for all their help. And to all of you who have joined us, these are archived. You can go to IPDGC's website, which is easily Googleable. It's at part of the George Washington family. The School of Media and Public Affairs is its home. It's a joint operation with the Elliott School of International Affairs. Kendra, I want to thank you for closing out with a really fascinating discussion. Your chapter was really wonderful. And I encourage people to get their libraries to buy the book and check everything out. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And sorry to those whose questions we didn't answer. I'm
Yeah,
happy to answer over email. Thanks again.
great. Thanks. All right. Thanks,
Thank you so
everyone.
much, everyone. We'll see you in the
Bye bye.
fall. I guess we'll have more of these, right?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah.
Great.
All right. Bye bye.
Thanks again.
Thank
Bye.
you.